Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. Last week, we interviewed a guest named Jason Gaddis, who talked about relationships in such a great way. If you haven't listened to that podcast, I highly recommend going back to last week's podcast and listening to it. It was fantastic. One thing that he brought to the table was a model of the different styles of relationships we can find ourselves in. He named them the playful relationship, the safety relationship, and the growth relationship. He mentioned that the first two, safety and playful, are relationships that are basically doomed. Not that they're necessarily doomed to end, but they're doomed to not be satisfying for the people in them. And he mentioned that one relationship that always works, the one relationship that is the most satisfying, is the growth relationship. And Joel and I had a conversation after that, talking about what kind of style of relationship do we have? Do we have a growth relationship? And as we explored that concept, we realized that we have the most uber focus on a growth relationship that we possibly could. That's really important to us that we have a growth relationship. So we started writing down what are some of the aspects or markers of our relationship that we feel are growth oriented, and could they be helpful to other people? Could this be something that would be powerful for other people that are trying to enter a growth relationship? So we wrote down a couple of things that have really worked for us, and they may sound a little counterintuitive. They might sound a little odd to the listener, but I think I really feel like these have been some of the biggest components to the success and the level of intimacy that you and I have been able to reach.
Yeah, and if you listen to the podcast on our wedding vows and how we set intention with our wedding vows and talked about what we're committing and what we're promising to each other when we entered into our relationship, you'll know that growth was a big piece of that for both of us. We separately went off and wrote vows, and both of us came up with this idea that we want to support each other in our individual growth and as our growth as a couple. It's a super important thing for both of us in relationship. And I don't think either one of us will ever enter into a relationship again in life unless it's a growth relationship. That's just really important to us. And so if you want to go back and listen to that too, the vow podcast about our wedding vows, that's another podcast that might set you up for this one if you're a brand new listener. So what are some of the things that we have that, at least for our personal perspective, have created this growth relationship for us? One of the frameworks that we enter into thinking about this, and I think this overarches everything, it's kind of the frame that we hang everything else on, is this idea that the relationship, we see the relationship itself as a third entity. It's not me and Antonia and there's two of us. It's me and Antonia, and there's a third entity, which is our relationship dynamic. There's a system running, a relationship system that we see almost as a third entity outside of ourselves. And I, Joel, have specific needs and desires and wants and experiences. And Antonia has unique experiences, desires, wants. And the relationship itself, this third entity, also has unique desires and wants and energies and experiences. And it's such an interesting interplay, like a triad. And if you think about this in a structural way, you can see how there are co-created experiences together that live in this third entity. There are co-created needs that this third entity has, this relationship has as itself. And it's kind of a mind twist a little bit to think of this at first. But if you can start to shift and see this third entity, this system running that is the relationship, it gives you a tool set, I think, to hang some of the other things we're going to be talking about today on this podcast. And it's really powerful stuff. So that's the framework that we're coming from. That's the architecture of how we see a growth relationship at the outset.
Yeah. One of the nice things about understanding the relationship as a third entity, especially as you mentioned that this third entity has its own unique needs, is if we're in a space of competing needs, I have needs going unmet, you have needs going unmet. A big question, especially if the relationship starts taking a hit because we're really in our stuff, we're really in our, I've got a need going unmet. One of the nice things about understanding that the relationship itself has needs is it can feel noble to redirect attention away from just what I need and just what you need into co-feeding the need of the relationship. So now instead of being combative, now instead of being on two opposite sides vying, for the need each of us believes is going unmet in ourselves, now we can become a team again to get the need of the relationship met. Now, that's not to say that the relationship needs always trump individual needs. That's not accurate at all. We also have individual needs. However, the relationship becomes a neutral ground. It becomes something that we're both on the same team to make sure that this third entity is protected. So it shifts any sort of combative stance we may unconsciously be taking. It shifts it back into a team stance. It shifts it back into, we do this together in order to get a bigger, this is the bigger thing met. Like, this is the thing that you and I both committed to nurturing. And so it really helps anytime we take a combative stance to put it away from combat and into teammates.
Yeah, and if you have kids, you're going to get this concept a little bit, because there is a third entity you and your lover or spouse have created. This little child that you both have to almost suppress some of your individual desires or needs or whatever. You might not be getting sleep at night because you got to get up and take care of the little baby that's crying. And you're both working as a team to caretake this. Hopefully, you're working as a team to caretake this child. Now, a child, that's a very tangible representation, right? That's a very tangible thing. But oftentimes, children can become the source of conflict. And I think in terms of that relationship, that third entity too, protecting that entity or that relationship, one partner might be more vested in that than the other. And that can also cause conflict. So it's important. It's a helpful tool, and it can also be a tool that can be leading you down a road toward codependency as well. So it's just something to watch out for. It's pretty abstract what I'm saying right now, but as we unpack how we hang things on this framework, I think it's going to become more clear as we go. We can talk more about that. But there's just some things to watch out for there, and also some things to think about, and it's a really powerful frame to start with.
Yeah, that's a good point. Protecting the relationship at all costs is not what we're talking about, because that will lead to codependence. It's recognizing that there are needs that aren't just yours and mine. It's recognizing that there is a third entity need. And you actually brought up a really interesting point before the podcast, Joel. You said, well, if the relationship has needs going unmet, and you won't do something proactive in behalf of your mate, you'll only do something proactive in behalf of the relationship. Like, why wouldn't you do that in behalf of your mate? Like, why does it take this third entity neutral ground to be able to take action? Why don't you do that because you love your mate? And I thought, that's a really good point. Like, why would we make it that the most noble piece is the relationship? And I don't think it is. I don't think that seeing the relationship as a third entity necessarily makes it like the most noble pursuit and protected at all costs. I think what it does is, if you're in a space where your relationship has become combative, it's the next phase of giving you that neutral space. It allows you to redirect the energies into a team again. But really, the highest level of growth, the highest level of, doing things for each other and getting needs met is, I want to do things for you, and I want to do things for me, and I want to do something for the relationship. I want it to be win-win all the way around. So my motivation is actually, I do want to get your needs met. And my motivation is, I want to get my needs met too. And the motivation is, I want to get the relationship's needs met. So really, that's the highest level that you're attempting to go toward. But it's really tough to get there if you have found yourself taking these combative stances. If you found yourself at odds with each other and getting needs met, it's a nice neutral territory. It's like almost like a stepping stone. And sometimes you can't skip steps. So it's a frame that we take that it doesn't make the relationship the most noble of goals, but it does definitely create a neutral zone if we need that for the moment. If we find ourselves not feeling like a team, we can find solace there. And also, it reminds us that it's not just about you and me, it's about us together as well. And now we have language around, like, we have needs going unmet, but it's not really my need and it's not really your need. Oh, it's the relationship's needs. And so it gives us language around fueling this thing between us.
The other thing that, as we talk about this, another framework just to have in mind as well, is how are we measuring success in this? And I think a lot of people would say, well, if I'm happy with this person, if I'm happy in this relationship, things are going well. If I'm unhappy, things are not going well. And I don't think that's an okay measurement. Like, that's a pretty low level measurement in my mind. I think because if you're growing, oftentimes during growth, you are unhappy, and your mate might be unhappy if they're growing. or if the relationship's growing, every time there's growth, you're putting more tension on something. Just like when you're, bodybuilding, you're lifting weights, you're putting tension on your muscles. You're literally ripping the muscle in order to grow that muscle. So it hurts, it's uncomfortable, it takes discipline and effort. You may not be happy in the moment. So this metric of happiness, I think, is a little bit misleading. And I think you can keep yourself at a low level of growth if you use that as your metric. Another metric I would posit as a better metric to this would be this idea of oneness, this idea of intimacy and oneness, meaning we might not be happy because we're growing and we're struggling through something. We're in the midst of a lot of disagreement or discord right now because we're trying to figure this next piece out. But even in the midst of that discord, even in the midst of being unhappy in the moment because we don't feel good about what's happening or the growth that we're having to do, we can still maintain that oneness with each other, that connection, that deep intimacy. And I think that, at least for me in relationship, and I think you would agree with me, Antonia, that is where the magic of being with one person comes into play. They know so much of your deep inner heart and your inner mind and your inner experience, and you share that oneness with them. It's almost like they're an extension of you, and you feel so connected to that person. It's such an extremely empowering and great feeling to have that, especially in the midst of bad times, especially when you're going through rough growth experiences. That oneness metric, and this is how I look at relationship to measure how well it's going. Are we one? Do we feel oneness between us? Okay, then the unhappiness, the discomfort, all that stuff is marginal because I feel that oneness. If we don't have that oneness, it doesn't matter how happy I feel individually for my actions or my growth, I don't have that connection. I don't have that oneness. I feel out of sorts. That metric isn't there for me. So this is what I would posit to you as a better metric than happiness to use as your measurement tool for a growth relationship.
Yeah, intimacy is huge. And I think that's what we've discovered in the things that we're about to mention that we've implemented is that our intimacy has grown so much. It's not really, we have plenty of fun. We have a lot of fun times. And I would say that we have a very happy life. I'm very grateful for my life. However, I would agree with you that the metric is how bonded do we feel? How intimate and vulnerable am I willing to feel with you? Huge metric. So one of the needs of the relationship that can get overlooked if you're just getting the needs of the individuals met is connectivity. Lots of time spent connecting. Now, connection happens differently depending upon different people. And this is where personality types will come into the relationship because different personality types connect in different ways. A lot of personality types connect by sharing activities or by just spending quality time together. They can connect by, doing like building things together or nesting, creating a home together. That's very connective. For yours and my relationship, Joel, it's conversation. Really lots of deep, abstract, what if conversation, concentrated time spent in that conversation is massively connective for us. But it's not going to be the same for everybody. However you connect, the need of the relationship is to ensure that you're getting that time. And I get how difficult that is. Like, we run a business together. We have a toddler. You have 2 children from a previous marriage that we have in our homes on a regular basis. So, and we drive a substantial amount of time to go get them and, to pick them up and to drop them off. We have very busy lives. We have a lot of commitments. And yet we make sure that we're carving out that time to spend together, concentrated connectivity time. I don't think it can be overstated.
Yeah, like this morning, we're supposed to be recording podcasts all day. We had some stuff set up to do some recording today and some other recording and things that we had scheduled. And we actually spent the morning, we were going to get right to work, and I had been out of town a little bit, and we're like, we really can't get into work until we reconnect first. We need to just spend some time with some great conversation, get back in rapport with each other. It's going to help the podcast go better. It's going to help all of our work go better. And we actually delayed work. We were supposed to start at like a certain time. We're like, actually, let's just continue talking. Let's go get some coffee together really quick. We drove over to Starbucks and grabbed some coffee this morning, and we just spent some time talking. And that was really important, I think, for both of us to reconnect after kind of being out of sorts for a couple of days. That kind of thing and that conversation connection. Now, again, it might be different for you. You and your spouse might want to go play tennis together, or maybe you guys want to repaint the walls in your living room, or, on a trip, you just go on a trip, or it's something just like, late at night, your spouse might just need you to sit at the foot of the bed and ask how their day went or something. Whatever that connection is for you, but that connective piece, reconnecting on a consistent basis, I think is very important for a growth relationship. It's greasing the wheels of conversation, which is how we relate, right? So you have to have that rapport in relation. And this seems kind of obvious, but you'd be surprised at how many couples, like, I don't know if they miss the piece or if they just forget that this is a priority, right?
Yeah, so many people live separate lives. That was a major struggle in my first marriage. And even though I'm very good friends with my ex-husband and we really appreciate and enjoy each other, we didn't make a lot of time to connect. And it was a marker of, I don't think that we should have been in a relationship with each other. And I think that one of the things that we did that allowed the relationship to atrophy, because our inner wisdom said we weren't supposed to be together, is that we just didn't spend that time connecting. And I think what's good to remember is, or one thing that's good to keep your finger on the pulse of, are some of the markers of strong connectivity. What are the things that really sort of show that you're getting this strong connectivity? And I think one of the things that you and I have noticed in our relationship is that we have like a language just between the two of us. It's filled with referential humor. It's filled with in-jokes. It's filled with, like we speak in a lot of models. And so, you as the audience or you as the listener, you would probably get a lot of our, like our quote unquote code or language because you're familiar with, say, cognitive functions in the Myers-Briggs system and some of the models that we teach. But like most people around us don't know what we're talking about. Most people around us, like when we speak in this little like, oh, what do you think that person's Graves level is? Oh, you think that might be a 6? Yeah, totally a 6 because blah, 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 blah. And we just have this little language that we've built with the two of us, between the two of us, because we've spent so much time connecting. And I've noticed that with couples that spend a lot of time connecting is that even if they don't have like a coded language, they at least have that referential humor, they have the in-jokes, they have like the sly sideward glance at each other when something happens and a little smirk. Even if they're not making fun of anybody, I'm not indicating that, but it's like they're sharing all of their moments together. And so they always want to be in that connected sharing space. Even if they're not directly interacting with each other, they at least want to be checking in with each other on a regular basis to go, hey, are you experiencing the same thing I'm experiencing? Oh, you are? Cool. We're relating. We're connecting. And so that's a marker of really like making sure you're getting that connectivity time. That will be one of the emergence.
I think another big piece of being in a growth relationship comes into one of the reasons you're together in a romantic relationship in the first place, which is there are a lot of sexual reasons. You're sexually attracted to your lover. You're in a sexual relationship with them. That's why they're not your friend. That's why they're not just, a cousin or something. They're your lover, right? That's part of the experience, is being sexually connected. And I think that our sexuality is very closely tied to our identity as people. I think we really see ourselves through our sexual nature, and how we show up to the world sexually is how we show up to the world. I really think this. This is a part of my belief system. Now, you might think differently, but this is how I see it. So I think that the willingness and ability to be vulnerable in your sexual expression, that doesn't mean you have to be super kinky or weird or anything like that, but it does mean that you have to be open to expressing yourself fully in your sexuality with your lover, with your spouse, with your partner. And I think them also being sexually open to expressing themselves. And that means some of your vulnerabilities are going to come to the surface. And knowing that that person is not going to use that as a weapon or use that against you or make you feel silly or stupid for maybe voicing or articulating or expressing your vulnerabilities or your desires or something that is important to you. They'll hold space for you working through those. And a lot of times, especially in our Western culture, I think, probably all cultures, we've got some jacked up views around sex because we're cultured into something that may not be what our natural proclivity is, right? And so this can be a very touchy, very personal, very identity-based place. And when you're opening yourself to another person, you've got to know that you're safe there. You've got to know that that's not going to be exploited. And that, in fact, there are growth things around your sexuality too that you're going to be going through. And knowing that your partner's got your back sexually is cool. Like knowing that you're not going to be ridiculed, that you're like, okay, I get you're struggling through this thing. I'm going to go ahead and hold space for it. Maybe your wife is like, I got to have sex with the lights off. I'm weirded out by you looking at me while we're having sex or something like this. And it's like, geez, like I not only don't want the lights on, but I want to do all this kinky stuff. And like, we're still having sex with the lights off. Okay, I'm going to hold space for that. Let's see if we can grow through that. Like these issues are important for each other, and to know where your partner stands and being open about that and holding space for where they're showing up and hoping for that growth is really important.
Yeah, you mentioned you don't have to be kinky or weird. I think what it is that if you are quote unquote kinky or quote unquote weird, and I say quote unquote because kinky and weird are totally subjective terms. If you are what you might fear is kinky and your mate might not be okay with that, when you mention the thing that we figured out is sexually like letting your guard down, sexually being open and vulnerable with your mate, it means you communicate that stuff. It means that you tell them how you feel. And the reason why this is such a major piece of the growth relationship is, as you mentioned, it puts a massive responsibility on us to create a safe space for our mate. If they can't tell us what they're into, we are not contributing to the safety of the overall relationship. You mentioned that how we see ourselves sexually is how we see ourselves. And people might have difficulty understanding what that means or how that could be, because we get a lot of propaganda about how sex is not that big of a deal. We get a lot of propaganda about how like our marriage should be worth, or focused on way more than sex. And that's true. There's a lot of components to a relationship that have nothing to do with sex. And yet, like you said, the reason we're together is to travel through life together with a pair bond partner. That can include children or not children, but a major piece of that is the pair bond piece, is the fact that we are in a sexual relationship with each other. And a lot of our insecurities, a lot of how we see ourselves in society is in the same imprint as how we see ourselves sexually, whether or not we're acceptable as people. Things we would never feel like we could admit to friends and family or to society as a whole. That is not something we should be keeping from our mate. That is something we should be talking to our mate about. So the responsibility becomes, I need to create a safe space, a safe container for my mate to tell me any and everything that they feel sexually. And that means that my mate has a responsibility to create a safe container for me so I can communicate how I feel about things sexually or what my sexual imprints are. And if my mate has created a safe space, they've created a container where I can literally tell them anything, and they're going to at least hold space for me. That doesn't mean that if we have a predilection that is like unacceptable, like take for example, if you have like predatory interests, your mate should be able to hold space for it without condoning it. It's not the same. Being able to hold space for those kinds of things is not the same as going, yeah, I totally approve of that. That's perfectly fine. But it is exploring an area that is super vulnerable for the individual, and that their mate should be the one person that can explore that space with them and help them work through it. But most of us don't have predatory leanings. Most of us are not dealing with that. So whatever our predilections are, whatever the thing that really turns us on or really gets us off or really like is that deep, deep part of us. If our mate has created a safe space for us and we still can't communicate it to the other person, then that means we're probably experiencing some trauma around it. And then that shines a great big light on a very dark spot for us. It's a massive mirror back to us that we have some work we need to do on ourselves. So this component of really letting your guard down sexually, really being willing to be vulnerable with your spouse about your sexual interests and what gets you off and what you really want to be doing, means that both people have a lot of work to do, because we don't get a lot of training around this. Most people do not give us training on like, okay, here's how you totally sexually open up to your spouse. And if you're not in this space, if you're missing this piece, there is an area of your mate's inner world and that you're not experiencing, and there's a part of your inner world that they're not experiencing. And that oneness that Joel mentioned, that grafting together of the two hearts, that grafting together of who you are as people, it's going to stall out. There's going to be this space that the two of you will not enter. And you won't be able to graft this component of each other together. So you're actually stalling your intimacy in other ways, not just sexual intimacy.
It's been my experience, and this is a personal experience, again, mileage may vary, that it's not that sexually you have all these things that you just can't tell your spouse. The reason why the ability to be vulnerable and open is because some of this is exploratory in nature. You may not even understand what your sexual wiring is. You've been programmed maybe your whole life to not even explore it, not even think about it, not even talk about it in certain ways, suppress it, hide it, cover over it. And then you get in a relationship, it's a growth relationship, and the person says, tell me, like, what's something that's interesting to you? How do you show up sexually? And you don't even know where to start because you have no practice doing that. But them saying, look, I'm going to be patient. I'm going to just hold space and let you become vulnerable here. I don't care where this ends up, where this leads. We'll figure this out together. And I think that's really what, for me, that's the path of growth, because I think a lot of times as people, we don't understand our full sexual nature when we get into a relationship. In fact, I mean, you kind of figure out your sexual nature through trial and error, like literally hands-on learning. You figure out how to have sex. It's not like you go to a class, you go to sex ed class, but they can't literally teach you how to have sex. You have to go have sex to learn how sex works and what you're attracted to and how you get turned on and how you get off and all these different aspects of it. It's a very hands-on experience. So you almost don't know until you go through the experience. That's why in a growth relationship, holding this space and creating this container for vulnerability is so powerful, because it's an exploratory process by definition. It's something that you don't just come knowing out of the gate. You have maybe some desires, but you don't really know how those are going to play out in a real world sexual experience until you try them. So I think this is what we're talking about, this idea of holding space for this.
Yeah, and I don't think we're recommending that if you don't feel safe with your mate, tell them all the stuff you're into or all the stuff you think you're going to be into anyway. It's not start with sexual exploration. It's start with safety and a container. So that's one of the reasons why even going down this road is so powerful for a growth relationship, is it forces you to ask the tough question, do I feel safe with my mate? Do I feel fundamentally, profoundly, very, like, to the core, like the marrow of my bones, do I feel safe with my partner? And if the answer is no, I don't feel like I can openly express all this stuff, that's a pretty big indicator that there's some work that needs to be done on the relationship. So what's great about this piece is it's not just sharing sexual desires with each other. That is a major, wonderful emergent that comes from it. But it really is about, how am I doing in this area? How am I doing with feeling open to being sexually explicit with my partner? How safe do I feel with them? And if the answer is I don't feel very safe, I don't think I can go down that road, you now understand that you have some work to do, that the relationship has a need of safety that is not being met. So again, looking at the relationship as this third entity, a need in the relationship is going perpetually unmet, which is a need for safety. So that's why this is so powerful, is it shines a light on work that may need to be done that you've been avoiding. And then, of course, once that work gets done and once you're able to explore that piece with your spouse, the rewards are huge. Like, a satisfying sexual relationship will definitely keep a relationship going pretty far. And that's one of the biggest complaints that people have. And, like, they hit the 7-year itch, or they're like, yeah, sex used to be really spicy and we had sex like every other day or every day or whatever. But, now we have like kids and maybe we have it like once a month, or, for some people, once a month would be awesome. Like, they're having sex so infrequently. So this ensures that there's not an atrophying of sexual desire. And again, you're with a pair bond partner, not only to explore life with, but also to be able to have a satisfying sexual relationship. It's really huge.
I think, so moving on kind of to the next piece here, when we get into relationship, I think our culture, at least here in the United States, has been that this relationship is an entity, and we as people are serving this external entity. And that's why I think early on when I said the framework of a third entity, it can become codependent at some point, where you start to serve the entity itself instead of what the entity's there to provide you. I know that sounds abstract, but flip that on the head. It's not that you and your spouse, let's say your relationship is constructed around marriage. It's not that you get married and you preserve the institution of marriage at all costs. This is my perspective. It's that the institution of marriage, if you decide to get married, serves you two as a tool for your relationship. So it's really about the two of you. And this externally constructed thing, like we talked about, this framework of a third entity, and in this case, a specific framework like marriage, gets layered onto that. It should be a tool serving the relationship, not the two of you serving this external tool. So if we see like a marriage in terms of it's a tool serving the relationship, we as people are growing and moving through life dynamically. And you haven't always been in this relationship. This is something that you constructed as a tool that serves you and your lover, your spouse, your mate, right? If you value that relationship over continuing to grow as a person, you have your priorities a little bit out of whack. Now, we just talked about looking at that third entity as a way to like stage conflict resolution and things of that nature. And that's true. That's important. But again, looking at it as a tool set, not as the thing itself. Like it's there to serve you. You're not there to serve it. And I think people lose sight of this. I think that's why we have such a high divorce rate is people enter into this notion that this structural thing, like marriage, for example, is going to structurally just take care of all the stuff that you've got to take care of as individuals. And for me, and I think you too, Antonia, I think both of us agree with this, that we're dedicated to our growth over our relationship. There's a priority level there. Now, we are dedicated to growing inside this relationship. We believe there are things that we can do inside this relationship and grow in ways that we can't do separately. And that's one of the reasons we're together, is to grow. The other reason is for like relationship, oneness, sexual expression. We love each other. We're sexually attracted to each other. Like there's a lot of cool things going on here, but there's a lot of layers. If this relationship started getting in the way of our personal growth, I believe you and I would start to have conversation around, okay, I have a sense here that we're hitting a limit on our personal growth because of this relationship. Can we either alter how we are looking at the structure of this relationship to enable growth again, or maybe it's time to consider this relationship complete. It's time to move on to the next thing in life, and we amicably pull out from that relationship. We separate out that relationship. It's not structurally there permanently just because it's a structure. Like we've created the structure, that means we can dismantle the structure at any time as well.
Yeah, I think the way that I would phrase that is individual growth, your individual growth trumps our relationship. So if our relationship has to die in order for you to continue growing as a person, then I'm willing to make that sacrifice because your growth as a human being is worth more to me than the relationship that the two of us have together. Very counterintuitive way of looking at relationships. Most people would not make that sacrifice. And yet what I've noticed is because your growth as an individual is more important to me than our relationship, I give you space to grow in all the ways that you need to grow. And you become a better version of yourself. You come back to the relationship as a better mate, as a person who is more qualified and more competent to feed the needs of myself and the relationship and yourself. So I've only ever experienced reward from it. And yet, even if I didn't experience the reward of the relationship, I still would feel like your growth as a person is worth more than our relationship. And I feel like you believe the same thing,
yeah,
vice versa. Where else am I going to find this? Where else am I going to find somebody as committed to my development as I am? And so it probably sounds super counterintuitive. I'm sure that this sounds super weird. And yet the fruit of this has been amazing. And the intimacy level that we've been able to go to has been incredible.
So some of the other things that we believe are ingredients of a growth relationship are mutually supportive goals and missions. So it's not that the two of you in a relationship have to be on the same page as far as like you're working at the same like nonprofit and like a mission-based, like we're going to go save the world of world hunger or whatever. That can be the case. For Antonia and I, we actually do work in the same business. We do have aligned mission in what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. I think what we're talking about more is at least you're not incompatible with what your mission or desire or motivation is and your goals in life. Like if one of you is like a vegan, and you have an ethical stance on veganism and the other person wants to own like a cattle ranch, you're going to have some trouble with your goals. It's like a basic level, like, incompatibility there. You probably aren't going to be together in the first place. But let's say you go down a road and you both decide to do something. One person wants to go and maybe be more free form as a world traveler, not really have a home base and live out of a suitcase and teach classes all over the world. And the other person really wants to maybe establish a home in one place and begin to build a friendship network and make more of an impact on a local level. Well, just that alone, like that's not really like worldview differences. It's just you have different goals on how you manifest the worldview. Both of you want to make an impact, and one of you wants to do it at a very local level. One of you maybe wants to do it at a more global level. So how do you reconcile this? Can you be supportive on these two things? And if you can, I think you're going to have a great growth relationship. If it's difficult to be supportive on those, if you just have an impasse, you're going to have some challenge in that growth relationship because you don't have the same desire of support in that.
Yeah, there's a lot of energy inefficiency, or maybe just lost energy, in trying to get the other person to care about what you care about as much as you do. And the person doesn't have to care about what you do. They just have to care about you and support you completely. So if you've got two people who are unwilling to support each other's missions, or you've got one person who's on mission and the other person isn't, and they're not supporting the person on mission, or the person on mission is not supporting whatever hobbies or desires the other person has. There's lots of different combinations of how it can show up in not a good way. If you are not supporting each other's missions, there's a lot of energy that gets lost in the conflict that comes up in, okay, so what are we going to do? Where are we going to throw our time and our resource? Like, where are we going to spend our money? Where are we going to spend our time? Is it going to be, like you mentioned, one person wants to world travel and the other person wants to nest. Well, I'd like to put a down payment on a house, and it's going to cost this much. Well, I'd like to take that money and, fly to some other continent. Well, we don't really have the money to fly to another continent because we got to put the down payment on the house, right? Like, how are you going to be spending your resource? And your personal energies will be drained through these conflicts and conversations. So if you are both massively supportive of each other, if you're cheerleading each other on, if the one person's like, yeah, I'd love to put a down payment on a house, but let's make sure that we grab a chunk of that and make sure that you can go to this other continent, or whatever it is. If you can figure that out, now your energies, your mental real estate and your energy real estate can be put back into your mission. And that feels satisfying. If you feel like your energy is being robbed from your mission, now you're not having a satisfying life and you're not growing. So having this compatibility, or at least the support of each other, even if it's not the same mission, having a cheerleading section for each, or being the cheerleading section for each other, is going to feel a lot more satisfying, and you're going to feel like you're in simpatico, even if you're not doing the same thing.
Yeah, and this can be pretty simple. It doesn't have to be super like mission based. Like in my first marriage, I wanted to build an online business. So I would spend my spare time working on this online business. Teaching social media, teaching online marketing. And my ex-wife now at the time was just very threatened by this idea of she just wanted me to go basically have a regular job and bring home the bacon, kind of traditional marriage arrangement. And that just made sense for her. And so it wasn't even that she wanted such a different aspect of life, and I wanted such a different, we just weren't on the same page of what kind of like money-making activity we were going to do as a family unit at the time, or as a couple at the time. And it was an impasse. I mean, there were a lot of impasses, but that was one of the impasses, and that was incompatible. It was very difficult to grow together. It was very difficult for me to grow as a business person. She wasn't even supportive of me being in business in the first place, let alone growing as a business person. So it was a big challenge, and it, ultimately a lot of these factors led to us not being together because we couldn't be in that growth experience. And that's not where you want to be as a growth relationship. You don't want to be in a place where you've got to fight for the thing that you want to do. It would be great if your spouse, your lover, your mate can say, yeah, okay, maybe that's not my thing. Maybe I don't want to be a veterinarian and deal with animals or pet therapy, but I get that's important for you. And I think we can construct a life where that's still possible, and I can still get my goals accomplished, and we're supportive on each other's goals or missions. And if you can align those together and do the same thing together, even better. But sometimes that's not possible. It's just finding a way to be able to be supportive in those growth paths of the mission and the goals in life.
And that leads us to the next component, which is having aligned narratives. So the way that we have chosen to see or engage and interact with reality is that we see everything that we experience as a story. It's a story that we're sort of making up as we go, because we don't really know what's going on. Like, neither Joel or I feel like we really actually know what reality is. We know what our perceptions of reality are. We know that how we engage with reality. We know the stuff that triggers us. We get kind of an insight sometimes into what our autoresponders are and the brainwashing that's happened to us throughout our lives. So we kind of have an understanding of what's going on. But fundamentally, we know that this is just a story we're creating. And because we understand that things are basically narratives or stories that we're building, to have aligned narratives and stories are really important. And one of the ways that shows up for people is in our belief systems. Our belief systems are our narratives. They're the things that help us, realize what's important to us. they oftentimes inform our interests. They definitely inform our values. So if we have conflicting or misaligned interests and values, or what we call narratives and stories, that's going to be a massive conflict well. Like you're just going to have nothing but conflict. So if you can make sure that your narratives and stories are aligned, and then when you don't have aligned narratives and stories, you make space for the other person's narrative. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. What's great about ensuring and being proactive about these aligned narratives is that, again, it will shine a light into a dark space if, say, you have conflicting interests or conflicting values that maybe you just haven't gotten around to talking about yet. So I knew a couple that neither was particularly religious when they got together, and they hadn't really talked about religion much until she got pregnant. And then all of a sudden, he was talking about how he wanted the baby to be raised Catholic. And she's like, oh, I didn't know you were Catholic. Like, I didn't even know that. You had never talked about being Catholic. I didn't know you were Catholic. And he's like, well, I'm not a practicing Catholic, but I want my child to be raised Catholic. Okay, well, that was a misaligned narrative or story about reality. That was a misaligned belief system, because she's like, I don't want my baby being raised Catholic. That's a great thing to figure out before you get pregnant. It's a great thing to figure out before you have a child, because now that can be a deal breaker. Arguing about what religion the child is going to be raised in can sometimes cause enough conflict where the people separate. And now they have a nasty divorce situation where now what religion the child is raised in has to be written into a custody arrangement. So you can have space for differing stories as long as it's not a deal breaker story. And having those conversations, again, goes back to plenty of connective time, plenty of conversation, plenty of getting to know each other, plenty of being very vulnerable. But making sure that your narratives and stories are aligned is extremely important.
We talk about narratives, and it's easy to think of these as static. And I would encourage you, the more flexible you can see your narratives, probably the more happiness and the more growth you're going to have in your life. And it's really easy to just like lock down on a static view of that. And I'll just take a real basic example of how narratives can play for you. And again, this isn't even a relationship, but let's say you're driving down the freeway and someone cuts you off. You can interpret that as that person's an asshole. Like they're just a jerk. They just want their thing. They want their way. They cut me off on the freeway. That's a narrative you can adopt. Or you could say, you know what? Maybe they didn't see me in their mirror. Maybe they just are absent-minded and they cut me off because they're not paying attention. That's another narrative you could adopt in that moment. The data is the same action happened. You have two different stories. Or you might have a third narrative, like their wife is in the passenger seat and she's pregnant and the baby's ready to like come out right now. They got to get to the hospital and it's an emergency situation. You don't know their story. You don't know what's going on for them. And you adopt the narrative like, well, maybe it's an emergency. They cut me off because they're trying to get to a destination. And this is another possible narrative. You could keep going down this. You could come up with 100 different reasons why this person cut you off. So why do you default to that person's an asshole? Why is that automatically your narrative default? What does that say about you as a person, that that's the narrative you chose about the person, that you have no clue why they cut you off? You assume you know, but you don't really know. So now translate that to relationship. Translate that to the narratives that are running, these strong narratives that we're raised with or that we've believed for a long period of time. They have nothing to do with cutting people off on the freeway. They have to do with raising kids Catholic or not, or the certain, how we interact at parties together, or how our friends show up and we interact with them, or whatever the narratives are running. What does it say about you if you adopt narratives that are disempowering to you and your mate and the relationship itself? Like, you can choose to adopt empowering narratives. They are fluid and dynamic. They're not static. And I believe that as you begin to go down the road of understanding the fluidity of narrative, the malleability of narrative, you will increase your happiness like crazy, because you get to choose how you feel about things. You get to choose the story around whatever happened, and you can be generous and gracious with that. And just think about that. That includes your mate and your lover. If they do something that triggers you, you could automatically go, oh, they're just being an asshole. They're being a jerk. They don't love me. They don't care about me. Or you could say, well, maybe they've got something going on I don't totally get yet. And through that stuff we talked about earlier, conversation and opening up and connection and working toward oneness, you can explore some of the things. Why am I choosing this bad narrative toward them? I must have something going on inside of me that's triggered here that I'm adopting this? So this is an idea I want you to play with as you're listening. Think about the terms of what narratives do you automatically adopt, and can you grab control of those and make them more palatable, more malleable, and flexible in your life? Because I think you're going to increase your happiness, your joy, and ultimately in your relationship, your oneness and your growth.
Yeah, generosity of narratives is huge. And I think that leads into what I would say is sort of the final leverage point. The final thing that we've, in our relationship, discovered has been profoundly influential in our happiness and in our oneness, our connectedness. And that is the question we ask ourselves and each other: would I rather be right or would I rather be happy? Now, this is a confusing question to some people, because I've heard a lot of people respond with, well, when I'm right, I am happy, right? But that's not the point of the question. The question is, am I going to double down so hard on my position? Am I going to refuse to open my frame up enough to understand how I could be wrong? Am I going to do that at the cost of actual connection with my spouse, at the cost of being able to be intimate with them? Am I going to choose my rightness? And I would almost say, would I rather be righteous or would I rather be happy? That righteousness we get when we just know we're in the right, and that indignation that we feel. Is righteous indignation a more satisfying place, or is connectivity and intimacy with my mate a more satisfying place? Personally, I would rather be happy than right. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to compromise my values. That's not really what we're talking about. We're not talking about giving up your identity or giving up your values or pretending that you believe something that you don't actually believe in order to keep peace. It's not a question for the relationship. It's a self-reflective question. It's how tightly am I holding on to my narratives and beliefs? How tightly am I holding on to something that I might actually not be able to back up? It's just something that's, that I just assume is true. Would I rather hold so tightly to those than to actually have a more open, intimate connection with my spouse? And most of the time, this shows up in petty arguments. It doesn't usually show up in like the big, like, oh, now you just stepped on a value of mine and I've got to like I have to have healthy boundaries and you just crossed a healthy boundary and I'm not okay with that. That's a totally different conversation. We're talking about the like, I just know I'm right about this, right? And it could be, I don't know, it could be a stat that you read in an encyclopedia someplace and like, what year was Martin Luther King shot? Well, I think it was this year. Well, I'm pretty sure it was this year. And you just stick to your guns, even though it's something that you could go verify. You just stick to your guns on this particular data piece, and you're just not going to relent, right? You're not going to let up. And you'd prefer to be right in the argument over being happy with your spouse. So frequently when we get into debates, not even debates, like if we get into actual conflict, when we get into a place where, like you hurt my feelings, right? Like you hurt me. And the other person goes, well, I didn't mean to hurt you. And you're like, oh, yes, you did. I know you meant to hurt me because I'm hurt. So therefore you meant it. Would I rather hold on to the indignation that this person hurt me? Or would I rather be willing to let go of it and go, okay, he's positing, Joel, you're positing that you did not intend to hurt me, that you didn't even realize it was happening. I'm going to let go of my righteous stance that you meant it. And I'd rather go, okay, so what actually happened there? How can we find some sort of resolution? How can we get back into intimacy and oneness and connection? That's the road I prefer to go down. And I find it to be an extremely powerful reframe whenever I'm in that space where I'm just holding super tightly to something that is not serving me.
And that's going to be tough. This is some very different. Again, this is a little more advanced, right? This is some tough stuff. And one of the things I've learned in my life to, like, as training wheels, like as a stepping stone for this, is I'll literally speak out what's happening for me in the midst of some of that conflict. So let's say you and I are in a disagreement about something, and I'm like, man, I've got to stay to my guns. And you make a very compelling case about like changing my perspective on something. Let's say it's, something we're doing in our house, for example, and I'm just like, really want this one thing and I want to be right about it. And now it's more about just winning the argument than even the thing it started out to be. If you're in a relationship, you know what I'm talking about, right? Because you have this thing, like all of a sudden it's about the argument and winning the argument than it is about the thing you started arguing about in the first place. And I'll stop myself and I'll say, I have a lot of ego around this. I'll literally speak this out loud to you and I'll say to myself and you, and I'll say, to change my perspective on this is going to really feel bad to me. It's going to feel like an ego hit. I'm going to feel like I'm losing something in this. I'm going to feel really awful, like I'm not being, and I'll even like all sorts of shit will pop up for me. Like I'm not being manly enough because I'm not standing my ground against the woman in my life, and I'm like backing down, and that's not cool. That's not masculine. That's not manly. And I'm feeling like I'm going to take an ego hit by changing my perspective because now I'm not congruent and consistent. And like I'll literally speak this out and get it out on the table of like almost objectively seeing what's going on for me internally. And it starts to lose its power over me in that intensity of having to be right in the moment and win the argument. And it is a big ego hit sometimes. And I think for you, Antonia, too, like if you have to go, okay, like I think I challenged you something the other day and you go, you're right. Okay. And you like, I forget I can't remember the specifics, but we were like in the midst of kind of a disagreement.
We were talking about discipline and how much you love being disciplined, highly disciplined, and how much I hate being disciplined, or being a disciplined person. And I was like really fighting it hard. I was like, oh, I hate the discipline of life. I hate like having this like rigid structure. And it's in part because I have a lot of association with living a very disciplined life and being rigorous and closed-minded. And so during the conversation, like I'm just, I'm like combating it. And then all of a sudden at one point I'm like, would I rather be right or happy? And I just went, I've got a lot of resistance to this. I can feel it inside of me. And at first I was like, I don't know why. I don't know why I'm so resistant. I just know that I'm massively resistant to this. And then as I was talking, I went, I think I know why, right? I think it's because as a child, I have these associations, blah, 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 blah. I mean, the conversation itself is not that interesting, but it's our habit of talking it out. It's our habit of acknowledging I have a resistance here. And like you said, it diffuses it. It strips it of power once we speak it. And I think it's a really like you basically taught me to do that in conversation. By observing the fact that you do it, by watching you do it, I learned the technique of talking it out. And it's been super powerful, like from stripping the intensity of the emotion, the wanting to hold on, it just strips it because now it's out there. Like holding on to it tight means that I get to protect it. But if I just put it out there, now what is there to protect?
Well, yeah, it's still an ego hit, but at least it's an ego hit for me. And that like makes it feel a little bit better. Like it doesn't feel as intense and like my soul's being ripped out and I'm like losing something in a battle. And it's like a stepping stone. And I think the next level is to get to a place where I don't have to call it out and speak out, hey, I'm taking a big ego hit by changing my mind on this, or letting you win this, whatever it is that we're arguing about. That's tough because it feels so real, so visceral. It feels like you're losing something. It feels almost like you're dying inside to some degree to like change or let go of that. So I think that's something that you can do if you're looking to, as like a hack or a technique in this, in the ability to let go of some of the ego you have, is just talk about it, call it out, get it out on the table and get it open. So we've talked about a lot of things today. We've talked a lot about some basics of building that growth relationship. And we've talked about some advanced things that you may disagree with, you might agree with, you might have never really heard about them before. Like, wow, I never even thought about relationship in that way. I've never even like perceived that that's possible. And maybe there's way more to a relationship I can create with my lover or my mate than I ever even thought possible. I need to go back and rethink this. We'd love to hear from you. Some of your thoughts around this, some of the challenges that are coming up from you, some of the triggers that are happening for you around some of this. And you've been listening to a lot of the podcasts about relationships in the past few weeks. We've been doing a lot of these. And we want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com, go underneath where this podcast is, and leave your feedback, leave your questions, start engaging with the community that we're building here. Because there's other people that are like you, like Antonia and I and you, that want to grow themselves, that are really dedicated to personal growth. You can also find the community over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you are feeling a sense of reciprocity or in a giving mood, please feel free to leave a rating and review for us on iTunes. It really helps us out they have an algorithm on iTunes that makes it so that they'll pitch us on other podcasts and they'll rate us higher on their charts if we get a lot of consistent rating and reviews. So if you haven't done so already and you feel inspired to do so, we humbly request that you leave a rating and review for us on iTunes.
And if this podcast has been impactful for you, will you introduce us to somebody in your life, a family, a friend, who you think would also enjoy being a part of these weekly conversations? My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We can't wait to talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.